Snow bit into Gwen's bare shoulders. Iron bit into her wrists. The pack that raised her had stripped her to a thin linen shift and chained her to the perimeter gates. A death sentence, wrapped in the guise of exile. Gareth called it justice for defying him. He thought she would freeze before dawn, a cautionary tale for the morning patrol. He didn't know the scent of her blood had already crossed the border, reaching a king who would burn the continent to ashes for a single strand of her hair. Iron handles cold differently than flesh. Flesh fights it. Flesh shivers, pulls away, and eventually goes numb. Iron drinks the cold. It swallows the freezing winter air and holds it, pressing that relentless ache deep into the bone. Gwen felt the rusted manacles leaching the last remnants of warmth from her body. Her arms were stretched high, bolted to the heavy oak and wrought iron crossbeams of the Broadmoor Pack's northern gate. Behind her lay the sanctuary of the inner keep. Warm hearths, roasting meats, the murmur of a community that had collectively decided to look the other way. Ahead of her lay the black pine expanse, a jagged, brutal wilderness where rogues starved and feral beasts hunted in the dark. Gwen's crime had been simple. Gareth, the Broadmoor Alpha, had demanded she submit to a forced mating with his second-in-command, a cruel brute who liked to leave bruises on the women he claimed. Gwen had refused. When the brute tried to corner her in the grain silos, she hadn't screamed. She had picked up a threshing hook and shattered his collarbone. For a female of low standing to strike a high-ranking male was treason. For her to do it without a shred of remorse was an insult Gareth could not let stand. You will hang here until the frost takes your fingers or the rogues take your throat, Gareth had told her just hours ago. He had stood close, his breath smelling of stale wine and roasted venison, a stark contrast to the bitter wind howling around them. Let the woods have you. You are no longer Broadmoor. He hadn't bothered to execute her himself. That would have required dirtying his hands. Gareth preferred the clean, bureaucratic violence of exposure. He had ordered the guards to strip away her furs, leaving her in nothing but a frayed, knee-length linen shift. Her bare feet stood on a small, icy stone block. If her legs gave out, her full body weight would hang from her dislocated shoulders. The sun dropped below the jagged tree line. Shadows stretched long and violet across the snow. Gwen let her chin fall to her chest. Her teeth chattered so violently they clicked like stones in a hollow gourd. She focused on her breathing. In. Out. Keep the air moving. Keep the blood pumping. She thought of the faces in the courtyard as she was dragged away. The baker who used to slip her extra rolls. The elderly wolves she had tended to during the winter sickness. They had all cast their eyes to the frozen mud. Cowardice was a heavier contagion than any plague. Survival in Broadmoor meant keeping your head down when the Alpha's temper flared. Gwen didn't hate them for their silence, but the isolation hollowed out a cold space in her chest that rivaled the winter air. Wind whipped through the bars of the gate. Ice crystals formed on her eyelashes. Her toes had lost feeling an hour ago. They were just dead blocks of wood pinned to the stone. The rough linen of her shift scraped against her shivering thighs, doing absolutely nothing to cut the biting gale. Blood trickled from where the iron cuffs dug into her raw wrists. It didn't flow far. It froze into dark, ruby-like crusts against the rusted metal. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift, a dangerous thing to do in the cold. Sleep meant death. But the waking world was nothing but agony. She remembered a different scent. 2 weeks ago, near the border rapids, she had been hunting alone, tracking a wounded elk. The air had shifted, a scent so rich, so terrifyingly dominant, it had forced her to her knees in the snow. Pine sap, ozone, crushed obsidian and hot blood. She had caught a glimpse of massive dark wolves on the opposite bank, royal guards, and among them a man with eyes like polished flint. Ronan, the Alpha King. He had looked across the rushing water. He had looked right at her. The connection had snapped through her chest like a physical tether. The mating pull, it was so violent, so absolute, she had stopped breathing. But she was a low-ranking nobody, and he was the ruler of the Northern Territories. She had panicked and run, hiding her scent in the mud, fleeing back to the miserable safety of Broadmoor. Now, hanging against the iron, she wondered if she had imagined it. A dying mind's hallucination, or a cruel trick of fate. If he was her mate, he was miles away, sitting on a throne of carved ironwood, unaware that the universe's other half was slowly turning to ice on a rusted gate. A branch snapped in the dark woods ahead. Gwen's head jerked up, her neck muscles screamed in protest. The black pine expanse was practically pitch black now, illuminated only by the faint, silver glow of the moon reflecting off the snowdrifts. Another sound, a heavy crunch, the sound of massive weight displacing packed snow. Rogues. It had to be. Gwen pressed her numb feet harder into the stone block, trying to push herself up, to ease the tension on her shoulders. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She was bait, a free meal served on a platter of Broadmoor iron. "Come on then," she croaked. Her voice was a cracked, dry rasp. "Make it quick." But the shadow that separated itself from the tree line did not move like a starving rogue. It did not skulk. It did not hesitate. It stepped into the moonlight. Frost hung in the air like suspended glass. The figure that emerged from the dark woods was entirely too large to be a normal wolf, and entirely too still to be a feral rogue. He remained in his human form, a towering silhouette wrapped in a thick, midnight black fur cloak that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Behind him, the tree line shifted. At first, Gwen thought her failing vision was playing tricks on her. The shadows themselves seemed to detach from the trunks of the pines. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. Massive, heavily scarred wolves and armored warriors, moving with a disciplined, predatory silence that defied their numbers. They didn't make a sound. No snarling, no snapping branches. Just the collective, terrifying exhalation of a lethal army stepping into the clearing. The scent hit her a second later. Ozone. Pine sap. Hot blood. The cold suddenly retreated. It wasn't that the temperature rose. It was that Gwen's internal temperature spiked, a biological override triggered by the sheer proximity of the male walking toward her. Her shivering stopped. The mating bond, dormant and battered by the cold, flared to life, burning through her veins like liquid fire. Ronan stopped 10 paces from the gate. He wore no crown. He didn't need to. The raw, oppressive weight of his aura was enough to suffocate anyone in a 50-yard radius. He looked at the gate. He looked at the heavy iron chains. He looked at the blood frozen to the rusted manacles. Finally, his eyes lifted to Gwen's face. The flint grey of his irises was gone, replaced by a bleeding, luminescent gold. His chest heaved once, a massive, shuddering breath. When he exhaled, the mist plumed from his lips like dragon smoke. Inside the Broadmoor keep, the alarm bells finally began to ring. It started as a frantic, singular clanging, then escalated into a chaotic cacophony as the watchtower guards finally noticed the army standing on their doorstep. Shouts echoed across the courtyard behind Gwen. Heavy boots thudded against the cobblestones. Torchlight flared, casting erratic, dancing shadows through the wooden slats of the gate. "Archers to the wall!" Gareth's voice bellowed, shrill and laced with sudden panic. "Hold the gate!" Ronan didn't even glance toward the shouting. He kept his glowing eyes locked on Gwen. He stepped forward. "Don't," Gwen whispered. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. "They'll shoot." Ronan reached the iron bars. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply reached through the heavy wrought iron and brushed the back of his knuckles against her frozen cheek. His skin was impossibly hot. The contrast was so sharp it made her gasp. Who did this? His voice was barely above a whisper, a deep, gravelly vibration that rattled the marrow in her bones. There was no rage in his tone, only a chilling, absolute calm. The calm of a man who had already decided that everything on the other side of this wall was going to die. "Gareth," she breathed out, unable to lie, unable to look away from his golden eyes. The Alpha. "Open the gates!" Gareth's voice yelled from the ramparts above them. Gwen could hear the familiar, arrogant sneer returning to his tone, now that he had a wall and 50 armed guards between him and the threat. "You trespass on Broadmoor land. State your business or we fire." Ronan slowly lowered his hand from Gwen's face. He wrapped both of his massive, leather-gauntleted hands around the thick iron bars of the gate. These were bars forged to withstand the battering ram of a rival pack, thick as a man's wrist and anchored into solid stone. He didn't speak. He didn't issue a demand. He simply pulled. The groan of stressing metal shattered the night. The sound was agonizing, a high-pitched shriek of iron bending against its will. The stone pillars holding the hinges cracked, sending dust and chips raining down on the snow. Up on the ramparts, the shouting abruptly ceased. A terrifying, breathless silence fell over the Broadmoor guards. Ronan braced his boots against the frozen earth and tore his hands backward. With a deafening crack, the heavy iron lock snapped. The hinges sheared cleanly off the left pillar. The massive gate buckled outward, warping into a useless, twisted heap of metal, before Ronan casually cast it aside into the snow. He stepped into Broadmoor. Gareth stood on the low stone balcony overlooking the gate, his face drained of all colour, the torchlight illuminating his wide, terrified eyes. The archers on the wall had their bows drawn, but their hands were shaking so violently that their arrows rattled against the wood. None of them released a string. Their wolves recognized what their human minds were struggling to process. You do not shoot an apex. You bare your throat or you die. Ronan reached up to the manacles holding Gwen. He didn't bother with keys. He gripped the heavy chain linking her left wrist to the crossbeam, his muscles bunching under his thick cloak. The metal snapped like brittle glass. He repeated the motion on the right. Gwen's legs immediately buckled. She had no strength left. Before she could hit the freezing mud, Ronan caught her. He gathered her into his chest, wrapping his massive, fur-lined cloak around her trembling body. The heat radiating off him was absolute heaven. He tucked her head beneath his chin, burying his nose in her frost-bitten hair. A low, terrifying rumble started deep in his chest, a possessive, protective growl that made the ground beneath them literally vibrate. He held her with one arm, cradling her effortlessly. He turned his face up toward the balcony, where Gareth stood, frozen. "I am King Ronan of the Northern Expanse," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a magical, oppressive resonance that forced every wolf in the courtyard to their knees. "And you have chained my Luna to a gate." Gareth's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The torch slipped from his hand and clattered to the stone. Ronan didn't wait for an apology. He didn't want one. He looked back at his army, still waiting perfectly still in the shadows of the black pine expanse. "Burn it," Ronan commanded, his voice cold and flat. "Leave nothing but ash." Smoke is a heavy thing in the dead of winter. It does not rise immediately. It clings to the frozen ground, rolling through the courtyard like a dense, suffocating fog, carrying the metallic tang of fresh blood and the bitter bite of burning pitch. Gwen pressed her face against the thick, coarse fur of Ronan's chest. The sounds of Broadmoor dying were sharp, brutal. Wood splintered under the weight of massive claws. Thatch caught fire with a rapid, hungry crackle that drowned out the frantic shouting. The screams of the Alpha's guard were abruptly cut short, replaced by the wet, tearing sounds of teeth meeting throat. She did not look. She didn't need to. She had lived in this pack for 20 years. She knew the exact layout of the courtyard, the exact distance from the gate to the armory, the way the barracks doors swung outward. In her mind's eye, she could track the slaughter. She could map the precise path Ronan's northern army was carving through the people who had stood by and watched her freeze. A part of her, the small, naive piece that still remembered playing in the courtyard dust as a pup, wanted to beg for mercy, to tell him it was enough. But the cold had killed that part of her. The iron cuffs had crushed it. They had stripped her, chained her, and left her to the dark. Survival in the lower ranks breeds pragmatism, not forgiveness. Let them burn. Ronan turned away from the chaos. He walked slowly, his strides long and deliberate, carrying her away from the ruins of the gate. His arms were steel bands beneath his cloak, holding her so tightly she could feel the heavy, measured thud of his heartbeat. He didn't rush. A king does not run from a battle he has already won. "My lord!" A voice barked through the smoke. Heavy boots crunched on the icy mud. Gwen turned her head just enough to see a massive warrior jogging toward them. His armor was spattered with fresh, dark crimson. He held a struggling figure by the back of the neck. Gareth, the Broadmoor Alpha, had been stripped of his fine furs. His face was a bruised, bleeding mess, his nose shattered, and his lip split. The warrior tossed him into the snow at Ronan's feet like a sack of spoiled grain. Gareth scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the ice, his eyes darting wildly between Ronan and the burning keep behind him. "Wait," Gareth choked out, spitting blood onto the white snow. "Wait. You don't understand." She defied a direct order. She assaulted a superior officer. "It is pack law. You cannot execute an Alpha for upholding pack law." Ronan stopped. He looked down at the pathetic, shivering man. He didn't shout. He didn't bare his teeth. The absolute absence of his anger was far more terrifying than a roar. "Pack law," Ronan repeated. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "You speak to me of jurisdiction while the mate of the Northern King bleeds on your snow." Gareth's eyes locked onto Gwen. True comprehension finally pierced through his panic. He saw the way the Northern King held her, the possessive, unyielding grip. He saw the luminescent gold fading back to flint grey in Ronan's eyes, a sign of a wolf fiercely, irrevocably bound to the female in his arms. "I didn't know," Gareth whispered, his voice cracking. "I swear to the goddess, I didn't know." "Ignorance is a poor shield against fire," Ronan said softly. He didn't give an order. He simply gave a slight nod to the warrior standing behind Gareth. Gwen buried her face back into Ronan's cloak before the blade fell. The wet, heavy thud of steel severing bone echoed cleanly through the night air. A second later, a heavy mass hit the snow. Silence followed, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the roaring flames consuming the inner keep. "It is done," the warrior grunted. "Leave the head on a pike at the crossroads," Ronan instructed, his voice as casual as if he were ordering a meal. "Let the southern territories see what happens when they touch what is mine. Gather the men. We ride north before the storm breaks." He adjusted his grip on Gwen, pulling the heavy fur cloak tighter around her shivering frame. The adrenaline was fading. The mating bond's initial, fiery flare was settling into a low, steady thrum, and the reality of her physical condition was crashing back down on her. Her body was a map of agony. "Keep your eyes open, little bird," Ronan murmured. The rumble of his chest vibrated against her cheek. "Don't let the dark take you yet." "I'm not a bird," she rasped. Her throat was so dry it felt lined with broken glass. "I'm heavy." A low, vibrating chuckle escaped him. It was a startling sound, completely at odds with the slaughter he had just orchestrated. "You weigh nothing. You are skin and ice. We will fix that." He carried her past the tree line, stepping into the dense, ancient woods of the black pine expanse. A massive, black iron carriage waited on the packed snow, hitched to 4 terrifyingly large draft horses. The royal crest of the north, a dire wolf crowned in pine branches, was etched into the dark wood. The carriage door was opened by another silent guard. Ronan climbed inside, not bothering to set her down. The interior was a stark contrast to the freezing world outside. It was a moving hearth. Thick pelts lined the floor and walls, and small iron-caged braziers burned with smokeless charcoal, radiating a fierce, dry heat. He sat heavily on the velvet-lined bench, keeping her firmly planted on his lap. He kicked the carriage door shut with a heavy boot. The heavy lock clicked into place. The sounds of the burning pack faded to a dull murmur behind the thick, sound-proofed walls. The carriage lurched forward, the iron-rimmed wheels crushing the snow as they began the long journey north. Gwen stared at the flickering light of the brazier, her mind blank, her body completely numb. She was alive, she was warm, and she was utterly terrified of the monster who had just ripped the world apart to save her. Pain returned before consciousness did. It started as a dull throb in her fingers and toes, escalating rapidly into 1,000 white-hot needles driving themselves beneath her fingernails. Thawing out is an ugly, agonizing process. The body remembers the cold, and it punishes you for bringing the heat back. Gwen gasped, her eyes flying open. She arched off the heavy furs beneath her, her hands curling into tight, useless fists. "Hold still." The voice was a low, commanding rasp. Heavy hands pressed her shoulders back down onto the mattress. She blinked, her vision swimming out of focus before snapping back. She wasn't in the carriage anymore. She lay in a massive 4-poster bed, draped in thick, dire wolf pelts. The room was cavernous, built of dark, polished stone and rough-hewn timber. A roaring fire dominated the far wall, casting dancing orange shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Ronan sat on the edge of the mattress. He had shed his heavy winter cloak and armor, wearing only a simple, dark linen tunic and leather trousers. Without the bulky layers, the sheer size of him was overwhelming. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the firelight, and his arms were corded with thick, scarred muscle. He held a small clay jar in one hand. The air smelled sharply of pine needles, camphor, and bitter roots. "My hands!" Gwen choked out, staring at her raw, blistered wrists. The iron cuffs had left deep, purple-black gouges in her skin. "Frostbite and iron poisoning," Ronan said flatly. His flint-grey eyes were locked on her injuries, his jaw tight. "The healers wanted to bind you and sedate you. I sent them out. You've been helpless enough for one night. I won't have you waking up strapped to a bed, even for medicine." He dipped 2 fingers into the clay jar, scooping out a thick, greenish salve. "This will sting," he warned. He didn't wait for her to brace herself. He caught her left hand, his grip gentle but completely immovable, and smeared the salve over the raw wounds on her wrist. Gwen hissed through her teeth, her entire body tensing as the herbs bit into the torn flesh. It felt like liquid fire. She tried to yank her arm back, a purely instinctual reaction to pain, but his fingers were iron bands around her forearm. "Steady," he murmured. He didn't look at her face. He kept his focus entirely on his work, his thumbs moving in slow, deliberate circles, working the medicinal paste into the worst of the damage. The sting means the tissue is alive. If it were numb, we would be cutting the hand off. The blunt, brutal honesty grounded her. She stopped fighting his grip, letting her head fall back against the pillows. She breathed through her nose, focusing on the scent of him, ozone and wood smoke, to distract from the burning in her arms. "Why didn't you let the healers do it?" she asked. Her voice was a raspy croak. Ronan switched to her right arm. "Because you don't trust them. You don't know them. I don't know you either." His hands paused. Slowly he lifted his head. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, the high cheekbones, the hard, unforgiving line of his jaw. He looked at her with an intensity that made the air in her lungs vanish. "You know me," he said. It wasn't a question. "Your wolf recognized me at the border rapids. She recognized me at the gate. My soul is etched into your marrow, Gwen. Do not play the fool with me. I don't have the patience for it." Gwen swallowed hard. The cynical, protective armor she had built around herself in Broadmoor felt thin and useless under his stare. "I know what the bond is," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But biology is not a relationship. You just slaughtered my entire pack. You burned my home to the ground. Your home left you to freeze to death on a rusted hinge." Ronan set the clay jar on the bedside table. He reached out, carefully brushing a stray lock of hair away from her damp forehead. "They were not your pack. They were your jailers. I just removed the walls." "And put me in a new cage," she shot back, gesturing weakly to the massive stone-walled room. "A prettier one, with better furs. But you dragged me here without asking what I wanted." A dark, dangerous smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of an apex predator who had finally cornered his prey. "If I had asked, you would have said no out of spite," Ronan said smoothly. "You are proud, you are stubborn, and you were dying. I did not cross a continent and rip a keep apart to engage in a debate. You are mine." He leaned closer, his chest brushing her bandaged arm. The heat radiating from him was intoxicating. "You can hate me for it, Gwen. You can curse my name. You can throw plates at my head when you have your strength back. But you will do it here. In my territory. In my bed." His voice dropped to a gravelly whisper, vibrating straight into her chest. "You are safe. Even if I have to protect you from your own stubbornness to keep you that way." Gwen stared up at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was completely unhinged. He was arrogant, territorial, and dangerously powerful. But as she looked into his flint-grey eyes, searching for a lie, she found nothing but absolute, terrifying devotion. For the first time in 20 years, she didn't have to fight to survive. She just had to survive him. Healing is a tedious, ugly business. It demands a vulnerability Gwen had spent her entire life burying. Over the next 4 days, her fever spiked, broke, and returned with a vengeance before finally burning itself out. The blisters on her wrists hardened into tight, agonizing scabs that pulled every time she flexed her fingers. Her toes regained their feeling, which meant a constant, dull throb that made standing feel like walking on crushed glass. She refused to stay in the bed. Sunlight, weak and pale, filtered through the heavy glass of the arched windows. Gwen stood barefoot on the thick, dire wolf pelts lining the stone floor, leaning heavily against the heavy oak bedpost. She wore a simple dress of dark, undyed wool someone had left for her. It was heavy, practical, and incredibly warm. The heavy iron latch of the door clicked. Gwen flinched, her muscles instantly tensing. Old habits died screaming. In Broadmoor, an unannounced door opening meant Gareth's guards were bored, or worse, drunk. A woman stepped into the room. She was tall, built like a bricklayer, with iron-grey hair braided tightly against her skull. A jagged white scar cut across her left jawline, disappearing into the collar of her heavy leather tunic. She carried a wooden tray, laden with a steaming bowl, half a loaf of dark bread, and a wedge of pale cheese. The woman didn't bow. She didn't offer a simpering, terrified smile. She simply looked at Gwen, assessing her the way a butcher assesses a tough cut of meat, and set the tray on a small table near the hearth. "You are out of bed," the woman stated. Her voice was a gravelly alto. "King Ronan said you were stubborn. I assumed it was fondness talking. I see he was just stating a fact." "Who are you?" Gwen asked. She kept her grip on the bedpost, forcing her chin up. "Ingrid," the woman replied, turning to stoke the fire with an iron poker. "I run the kitchens. I also patch up the idiots who catch a blade during training. The king asked me to bring your meals. He trusts very few people not to poison you." Gwen stared at her. "Poison me? I'm a nobody from a dead pack." "You are the Luna of the Northern Expanse," Ingrid corrected, tossing a fresh log onto the flames. Sparks danced up the blackened chimney. "You carry the king's mark in your soul, if not on your neck yet. That makes you a target for every ambitious rogue and rival alpha from here to the southern coast. Drink the stew. It has bone marrow. You look like a plucked crow." Ingrid didn't wait for a dismissal. She simply walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. Gwen slowly released her death grip on the wood. Her legs trembled. She made her way to the table and sat heavily in the high-backed chair. The stew smelled of roasted venison and bitter root vegetables. It was the richest food she had ever seen, let alone eaten. She picked up the wooden spoon with stiff, aching fingers and forced herself to eat slowly. Her stomach, shrunken from years of meager rations, threatened to reject the heavy meal. A draft swept through the room as the door opened again. This time, the pressure in the air shifted instantly. The subtle scent of ozone and pine washed over the room, drowning out the smell of the hearth. Ronan stepped inside. He wore riding leathers dusted with fresh snow, a massive broadsword strapped to his hip. He looked tired. The harsh lines of his face were drawn tight, and his flint-grey eyes carried the dark shadow of a man dealing with the logistical nightmare of running an empire. He stopped when he saw her at the table. "You should be resting," he said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated against the stone walls. "If I lie in that bed any longer, my spine will fuse to the mattress," Gwen replied. She set the spoon down, refusing to break eye contact. "I am not made of glass, and I am tired of staring at the ceiling." Ronan unbuckled his sword belt and leaned the weapon against the stone wall. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling out the chair opposite her. He sat, invading her space with his sheer size, and studied her face. He noted the dark circles under her eyes, the tight line of her jaw, the way she subconsciously guarded her bandaged wrists. "Ingrid says you're a difficult patient," he murmured. "Ingrid has known me for 3 minutes. Ingrid is an excellent judge of character." Ronan leaned his elbows on the table, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. "You want to know what happens now? I can smell the anxiety rolling off you, Gwen. It smells like burnt copper. Stop chewing on your own thoughts and ask me." Gwen swallowed the sudden lump in her throat. He didn't play games. He didn't offer empty platitudes. "Am I a prisoner here?" she asked bluntly. "No. Then what am I? A trophy? A political prop to show the other territories that the Northern King found his fated mate?" She gripped the edge of the table. "I survived Broadmoor by keeping my head down. I don't know how to be royalty. I don't know how to play the games that keep people like you in power." Ronan's eyes darkened. He reached across the table, his massive, calloused hand covering her small, trembling fingers. His touch was burning hot, completely grounding. "I did not level a fortress to bring home a political prop," Ronan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register. "And there are no games in the North. If someone insults you, you do not smile. You break their jaw. If someone threatens you, I cut their throat. You are here because you belong to me, and I belong to you. The rest of it, the titles, the court, the politics, is just noise. He stood up, his grip tightening briefly on her hand before releasing it. Finish your meal. If you are strong enough to argue with me, you are strong enough to walk. I will return in an hour. It is time the pack saw the woman who holds their king's leash. Stone corridors echoed with the heavy, rhythmic footfalls of the Northern Guard. Gwen walked beside Ronan, actively resisting the urge to lean against his massive frame, despite the agonizing tremors in her thighs. He slowed his naturally long strides to match her limping pace, a silent concession she noted but refused to acknowledge aloud. The keep was a fortress forged in ice and iron. It lacked the tapestries and ornate carvings she remembered from the southern territories. Here, the walls were bare, fitted stone. The sconces holding the torches were wrought iron, styled like wolf fangs. Every person they passed, servants, warriors, scribes, stopped and lowered their heads, baring their throats in a silent display of absolute submission. They weren't just bowing to him. They were bowing to her. Gwen kept her face blank, a mask she had perfected over 2 decades of abuse. Inside, her stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. She felt like an imposter wearing stolen clothes. Breathe, Ronan murmured, not looking down at her. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back. It was a casual touch, but the heat of his palm seared through the thick wool of her dress. You are projecting terror. They will smell it. I am terrified, Gwen shot back, her voice barely a whisper. Half these men look like they chew gravel for breakfast. They do, Ronan replied, the faintest hint of amusement in his gravelly voice. But they are mine, which means they are yours. Remember that. He stopped before a pair of towering, black ironwood doors. 2 guards, massive brutes, heavily scarred and armed with halberds, immediately pushed the doors open. A wall of sound and heat hit Gwen like a physical blow. The great hall was cavernous. 4 massive hearths roared along the side walls, roasting entire stags on heavy iron spits. Long, rough-hewn tables stretched across the stone floor, packed with hundreds of wolves. They were loud. They were drinking from heavy tankards, arguing, laughing, and tearing into roasted meat with a feral lack of manners. The moment Ronan stepped over the threshold, the noise died. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was an instant, suffocating silence. Hundreds of pairs of eyes snapped toward the doorway. The energy in the room shifted from chaotic revelry to taut, predatory focus. Ronan didn't say a word. He didn't need to demand their attention. He simply walked forward, guiding Gwen down the central aisle. Gwen felt the weight of their stares physically pressing down on her. They were looking at her bandages. They were looking at her slight frame, the pale, sickly tint of her skin that the firelight couldn't completely hide. In a pack built on raw power and survival, she looked like a dying rabbit dragged into a wolf den. They reached the high table on the raised dais. Ronan didn't direct her to a smaller seat beside him. He pulled out the heavy, fur-draped chair matching his own. The Luna's seat. Gwen sat. Her knees were practically shaking out of their joints. Ronan sat beside her, signaling the room with a brief, sharp nod. The noise slowly resumed, but it was muted now. Hushed conversations replaced the boisterous roaring. A man detached himself from the nearest table and approached the dais. He was older, with a thick, silver-streaked beard and a face heavily marred by old claw marks. He wore a heavy chain of office over his leathers. He didn't bow his head as low as the others had. "My king," the man said. His voice was a deep, resonating bass. He turned his scarred face toward Gwen. "And this is the prize you burned Broadmoor to ash for." It wasn't quite an insult, but it wasn't a compliment either. It was a challenge. Ronan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing into dangerous, flinty slits. Watch your tone, Garrick. You are speaking to your Luna. I am speaking to a woman who looks like a stiff wind would snap her in half, Garrick replied evenly, though his eyes darted nervously to Ronan's resting hand. The North is a brutal place, my king. You know this. We need a mother who can survive the winter, not one who will freeze in it. The silence returned to the hall. Every ear was straining to hear the exchange. Ronan's jaw clenched. The air temperature in the room literally dropped as his aura flared. A crushing, suffocating weight that made several warriors at the nearest tables choke on their ale. He started to rise from his chair. Gwen moved first. She didn't think about it. If Ronan fought her battles for her, they would never respect her. They would only fear him. She slammed her bandaged hand flat onto the heavy oak table. The loud smack echoed sharply over the tense silence. Pain flared up her arm, but she ignored it. I survived 20 years in a pack that treated me like dirt, Gwen said. Her voice wasn't a roar, but it cut through the quiet hall with absolute clarity. She locked eyes with Garrick, refusing to shrink back. I survived a forced exile. I survived being chained to a rusted gate in a blizzard in a linen shift. Do not confuse a lack of bulk with a lack of spine, Garrick. She leaned forward slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. A stiff wind won't break me. I've survived storms that would have frozen the blood in your veins. Garrick stared at her. He looked at the fresh blood seeping through the white bandages on her hand, a direct result of her slamming it onto the wood. He looked at the fierce, unyielding fire in her exhausted eyes. Slowly, the scarred warrior lowered his chin. He bared his throat, exposing the vulnerable flesh in a deep, genuine bow. "Forgive me, Luna," Garrick rumbled, a strange, approving grin touching his lips. "It seems the king has brought us a wolf, after all, not a sheep." Beside her, Ronan let out a low, vibrating chuckle. The oppressive weight of his aura vanished. He reached over, casually taking her bleeding hand and resting it on his thigh, a deeply possessive gesture that left no room for doubt. "Sit, Garrick," Ronan commanded, his voice rich with satisfaction. "And pour the wine. We have a return to celebrate." Gwen let out a slow, shaky breath. She was surrounded by killers, warlords, and monsters. But as she looked at the faces in the hall, faces that were now looking at her with a budding, genuine respect, she realized something terrifying. She might actually belong here. Water dripped from the cavern ceiling, landing with a hollow, echoing plink against the surface of the thermal pool. Deep beneath the ironwood and stone of the northern keep, the earth held its own fire. Geothermal springs cut through the bedrock, filling natural limestone basins with steaming, mineral-heavy water. It smelled strongly of sulfur and crushed chalk. To Gwen, it smelled like survival. Ingrid had practically dragged her down the winding, torchlit stairs that morning. The frostbite in her extremities was healing, but the cold had settled deep into her joints, leaving a residual stiffness that made her walk like a woman 50 years her senior. "Get in," Ingrid had ordered, tossing a rough linen towel onto a nearby rock. "If the cold stays in the bone, it rots the marrow. The heat will pull it out." Gwen sat on the submerged stone ledge, the water lapping just below her collarbones. The intense heat was a physical shock, turning her pale skin a mottled, angry pink. It stung fiercely for the first 10 minutes, a barrage of pins and needles attacking her healing nerves, before slowly giving way to a bone-deep, intoxicating relief. She closed her eyes. Her muscles, locked in a state of permanent tension since the night she was chained to the gate, finally began to unspool. Footsteps sounded on the stone stairs. Heavy. Measured. Gwen's eyes snapped open. She sank lower into the milky, mineral-clouded water, her instincts immediately flaring. Ronan stepped out of the stairwell shadows. He wore no armor, only a loose, unlaced tunic and dark trousers. The humid air immediately curled the dark hair resting against his brow. He didn't look surprised to find her there. He carried a clean stack of folded tunics and set them near Ingrid's abandoned towel. "Ingrid said you were torturing yourself," Ronan said. His voice was a low rumble, carrying easily over the bubbling water. "Ingrid lacks a bedside manner," Gwen shot back. She kept her arms wrapped tightly around her knees beneath the surface. "And she left 40 minutes ago. Did you come to check if I had drowned?" "I came to see if you were ready to stop fighting your own recovery." He walked to the edge of the basin and sat on the rim, pulling off his heavy leather boots. Gwen watched him warily. "I'm not fighting it. I'm sitting in boiling sulfur, exactly as instructed." Ronan didn't smile, but a familiar, dangerous warmth flickered in his flint-grey eyes. He stripped his tunic off over his head. His chest and shoulders were a road map of brutal history. Thick, silvery lines cut across his ribs, while a massive, jagged burn scar covered the left side of his abdomen. This wasn't the unblemished skin of a pampered king. This was the body of a warlord who had bled for every inch of ground he held. He slid into the water opposite her. The pool was large enough that he was several feet away, but the displacement of the water pushed a wave of heat directly against her chest. "You carry your tension like a shield, Gwen," he murmured. He leaned his head back against the jagged limestone wall, closing his eyes. "You sit at my table and stare down my commanders, and then you come down here and wait for the roof to cave in. You are waiting for the trap to spring." Gwen looked at the water. The cloudy surface hid her scars, but she knew exactly where they were. "In Broadmoor, if the Alpha gave you a soft bed and a hot meal, it meant he was about to ask you to do something terrible," she said quietly. The admission tasted like old copper on her tongue. Kindness wasn't freely given. It was a currency, a down payment on abuse. I don't know how to exist in a place where I'm not waiting for the debt collector. Ronan opened his eyes. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her she was safe now, because words meant nothing to a woman raised in a cage. He shifted off the wall, wading slowly through the chest-deep water until he was sitting on the ledge directly beside her. He reached under the water and found her hand. His thick fingers gently traced the raised, healing scabs around her wrist. "I have no use for currency," Ronan said. The vibration of his voice traveled through the water, settling into her chest. "I own the continent. I have nothing to buy from you, Gwen. I don't want your gratitude. I don't want your submission." "Then what do you want?" she asked. Her voice cracked, a raw, vulnerable sound that she hated. Ronan turned his head, his face inches from hers. The heat radiating from his skin rivaled the boiling spring. "I want the woman who shattered a captain's collarbone rather than be handled," he whispered fiercely. "I want the woman who slammed her bleeding hand on a table full of killers and demanded their respect. I want you to look at my territory and realize it is yours to shape. I want my equal." He lifted her hand from the water, pressing the scarred inside of her wrist to his mouth. It wasn't a sexual kiss. It was a mark of absolute, terrifying devotion. The rough scrape of his jaw against her sensitive skin sent a jolt of pure electricity straight down her spine. The mating bond, which had been a low simmer for the past week, suddenly roared to life, demanding she close the distance between them. Gwen didn't pull away. For the first time, she let her head rest against his bare shoulder. The muscle beneath her cheek was hard as iron, but the heartbeat drumming against her ear was steady. Grounding. "I don't know how to be a queen," she admitted softly into his skin. "Good," Ronan replied, his arm wrapping around her waist, anchoring her to his side in the warm water. "Queens are political figureheads. You are a Luna. You just have to be a wolf. War smells like oiled leather and stale sweat." Gwen learned this the moment she stepped into the tactical map room 3 days later. The chamber was circular, situated high in the northern tower, with narrow slit windows designed to keep out arrows and trap the biting winter draught. A massive circular table carved from solid oak dominated the center of the room, covered in curling parchment maps and small wooden blocks carved to represent pack garrisons. Garrick stood at the table's edge, his scarred face tight with frustration. Across from him stood a young scout named Finn, his riding leathers completely soaked with melted snow. Finn looked exhausted, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. Ronan stood at the head of the table, his hands planted flat on the wood. He was a storm held in check. The air in the room was thick with his suppressed rage, making it difficult to draw a full breath. Gwen entered quietly. She wore a heavy, dark green velvet gown today, trimmed with dark fur. Her wrists were still wrapped in clean white linen, but the limp in her step was nearly gone. "Report!" Ronan commanded, his voice cold enough to crack stone. He didn't look up, but his left hand shifted slightly, opening a space at the table directly beside him. Gwen stepped into it. Finn swallowed hard, his eyes darting quickly to Gwen before locking back on the king. "The Southern Coalition has officially mobilized, my king. Lord Arthur of the Riverbend Pack has rallied the remnants of Broadmoor. They've absorbed Gareth's surviving guard. They are claiming you broke the ancient treaties by executing an alpha without a tribunal." Garrick slammed a heavy fist onto the table. The wooden blocks rattled. "Arthur is a scavenger. He's been waiting for an excuse to test our borders for a decade. Gareth's execution is just the pretext." "He has blocked the grain shipments through the Valley Pass," Finn added, his voice dropping. "He says no trade moves north until the Luna is returned to the south to stand trial for treason against Broadmoor." Silence fell over the room. It was an ugly, heavy silence. Gwen felt a cold spike of dread drive itself into her stomach. Trial for treason. They wanted her back. They wanted to string her up, not on a gate this time, but on a scaffold, to prove that the Northern King could bleed. Ronan slowly lifted his head. His flint-grey eyes were entirely gone, replaced by a bleeding, luminescent gold that cast a harsh glow across the map table. The wood beneath his hands began to splinter. "Call the banners," Ronan whispered. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than a shout. "Empty the garrisons. I want 10,000 wolves marching south by nightfall. I will leave Riverbend a smouldering crater. I will pave the Valley Pass with Arthur's bones." "My king, wait," Garrick said, his tone urgent. "A full march south in the dead of winter. The snows in the pass are 10 feet deep. We will lose hundreds to frost and starvation before we even reach their borders. This is a tactical trap. Arthur wants us to march out of the mountains." "I do not care about the snow," Ronan snarled, the sound vibrating ominously in his chest. "He demanded my mate." Gwen stared at the map. She looked at the wooden blocks marking the Riverbend territory, situated deep in the fertile valleys below the mountain range. She knew Arthur. Not personally, but she knew his reputation. Broadmoor had traded with him. Gareth had despised him because Arthur was wealthy, insulated by river trade, and arrogant. "You don't need 10,000 wolves," Gwen said. The sound of her voice broke the aggressive tension in the room. Garrick looked at her in surprise. Ronan's head snapped toward her, his golden eyes burning. "Gwen, stay out of this," Ronan warned, his voice thick with the gravelly resonance of his wolf. The protective instincts of his beast were overriding his tactical mind. "No," she replied evenly. She stepped closer to the table, ignoring the oppressive weight of his aura. She reached out and picked up the wooden block representing Riverbend. "Arthur isn't a warrior. He's a merchant. He doesn't want a war with the North. He wants leverage. He wants a better tax rate on the lumber and ore you send south." Finn stared at her. Garrick frowned, leaning closer to the map. "He demanded you stand trial, Luna." Posturing, Gwen said, tossing the block back onto the parchment. He knows the king won't hand me over. It's an impossible demand designed to make you panic and march into a winter meat grinder. If you march out of the mountains, you validate his claim that you are a warmonger breaking treaties. Ronan's breathing was heavy, his eyes fixed on her face. The luminescent gold flickered, fighting a battle between rage and reason. What is your counsel, then? You don't send an army, Gwen said, looking up to meet his intense gaze. You send an emissary. You send someone to call his bluff. Absolutely not, Garrick interjected. Sending a diplomat makes us look weak. It shows we are willing to negotiate over the life of our Luna. You don't send a diplomat to negotiate, Gwen corrected, a sharp, cynical edge creeping into her voice. The lessons she had learned surviving in the mud of Broadmoor were finally bearing fruit. You send a strike team to remind him why the North doesn't need treaties. Riverbend relies on the southern aqueducts for their grain mills. They freeze over in winter, but they use pitch fires to keep the water flowing. She tapped a specific point on the map, a narrow gorge just above Arthur's territory. Send 50 of your best shadows, not to fight his army. Have them destroy the pitch fires and shatter the aqueduct walls, Gwen said. She looked back at Ronan, her expression entirely ruthless. Let Arthur's mills freeze solid. Let his people panic when the grain stops processing. When his economy stalls in 3 days, send a single rider to his keep with a message. The next time he speaks the Luna's name, you won't freeze his water. You'll freeze his blood. The silence that followed was absolute. Finn was staring at her with wide, terrified respect. Garrick's scarred face slowly split into a wide, feral grin. He looked from the map to Gwen, and then to Ronan. By the goddess, Garrick rumbled, bursting into a rough laugh. She is a northern wolf. She fights like the ice. The luminescent gold finally faded from Ronan's eyes, replaced by a flint grey that practically glowed with pride. He looked at his mate, seeing not a broken girl from a dead pack, but the terrifyingly pragmatic queen he had known was buried inside her. Finn, Ronan ordered, his eyes never leaving Gwen's. Tell the Shadow Guard to pack explosives and climbing gear. We are going to break Arthur's spine without drawing a single sword. Snowflakes the size of silver coins drifted down onto the black stone of the northern battlements. Gwen leaned against the heavy parapet, wrapped in a massive mantle of dark bear fur, and watched the valley road. She didn't shiver. The biting wind still stung her cheeks, but the deep, marrow-freezing terror of the cold was gone. The internal fire of the mating bond and the relentless, unyielding presence of the man standing just behind her kept the winter at bay. 3 weeks had passed since the Shadow Guard slipped into the southern valleys. 3 weeks since the aqueducts feeding the Riverbend territory had shattered under the cover of darkness. Down in the courtyard, the heavy iron gates groaned open. They didn't break. They swung smoothly on well-oiled hinges, welcoming a lone, exhausted rider wearing the blue and silver colors of Riverbend. The man's horse was lathered in sweat despite the freezing temperature, its head hanging low. Arthur didn't come himself, Ronan noted. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating against the fur at Gwen's shoulder. He stepped closer, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her back against his solid chest. He sent a proxy. A coward to the bone. A coward who is currently starving in the dark, Gwen corrected smoothly. She rested her hands over his thick forearm. Her wrists were unbandaged now. The skin was scarred, leaving pale, jagged bands around her forearms, but the pain was a distant memory. Let's go hear what he has to say. I imagine he is very eager to speak with us. They descended into the great hall. The atmosphere was vastly different from her first night here. The boisterous roaring of the pack was muted, replaced by a disciplined, heavily armed silence. The Northern Guard lined the walls, their faces carved from stone. At the center of the room stood the Riverbend envoy. He was young, too young for this kind of burden. His fine southern silks were stained with travel mud, and his hands trembled visibly as he looked up at the high table. Gwen walked up the dais and took her seat. Ronan sat beside her, but he didn't lean forward. He leaned back into the heavy furs of his throne, crossing his arms over his chest. He was making a deliberate, highly visible statement to the entire room, and to the southern spy standing before them. The king was present, but the Luna held the floor. "Speak," Gwen commanded. Her voice didn't waver. It cut through the cold air of the hall, clear and absolute. The young envoy swallowed hard. He dropped to one knee, bowing his head so low his forehead practically touched the flagstones. "Lord Arthur sends his deepest regrets, King Ronan. Luna Gwen," the boy stammered, his voice cracking. There was a grave misunderstanding regarding the laws of extradition. Riverbend formally retracts all demands. Furthermore, Lord Arthur offers a tribute of gold, southern silks, and unhindered access to the Valley Pass in perpetuity in exchange for your assistance with our frozen mills. Garrick, standing near the hearth, let out a low, derisive snort. Gwen didn't smile. She looked at the boy, smelling the raw, metallic tang of his terror. A few months ago, she would have felt pity. She would have seen herself in his trembling hands. But the cage had burned. The chains were broken. She was no longer a victim. She was the architect of the North. "Keep your silk," Gwen said coldly. The boy flinched. "The North has no use for fragile things, and your gold will not feed the lower territories when the deep snows set in." She leaned forward, resting her scarred wrists on the heavy oak table. Every eye in the hall tracked the movement. "You will return to Arthur with my terms," Gwen stated. "He will send 300 heavy wagons of processed grain to the border garrisons by the end of the month. He will cut his lumber tariffs in half, and he will personally execute the remaining guards who served under Gareth of Broadmoor. They watched a woman freeze on a gate, and they did nothing. I want them gone." The envoy looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Luna, 300 wagons. That is half our winter reserve." "Then Arthur should learn to eat less," Gwen replied, her voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "Or he can learn to eat snow. If those wagons are not at the border in 10 days, the Shadow Guard will return. And next time, they won't target the aqueducts. They will target the keep. Do we have an understanding?" The boy stared at her. He looked past her to Ronan, desperately seeking a reprieve, a sign that the king would be more reasonable. Ronan simply smiled. It was a terrifying, feral baring of teeth. "You heard your Luna. Ride south, and ride fast." The envoy scrambled to his feet, bowing frantically before fleeing the hall. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him. A moment of silence hung in the air. Then Garrick began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and erupted into a booming roar of approval that was quickly echoed by the rest of the guard. Tankards slammed against the tables. The North was howling for her. Gwen let out a slow breath, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. She turned to look at Ronan. His luminescent golden eyes were blazing, completely consumed by the mating bond and a primal, overwhelming pride. He didn't care about an audience. He reached across the space between their chairs, gripping the back of her neck, and pulled her in. His kiss was brutal, hot, and desperately possessive. It tasted of ozone and victory. Gwen kissed him back just as fiercely, her fingers burying into the dark hair at the nape of his neck. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. The roaring of the pack faded into the background. "Ice and iron," Ronan whispered, his breath warm against her lips. "You are magnificent." Gwen looked into the eyes of the monster who had burned her past to ash. She felt the heavy stone of the keep around them, the loyalty of the killers guarding their walls, and the unyielding devotion of the Alpha King. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was exactly where she belonged. And that brings our dark winter tale to a close. Gwen didn't just survive the ice, she conquered it, transforming from a discarded outcast into the terrifyingly pragmatic Luna the North needed. If you loved watching Gwen step into her power and Ronan burn the world for his mate, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next fantasy romance. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Gwen's revenge? Share this video with your fellow werewolf romance fans, ring the notification bell, and we'll see you in the next story.